Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Toby Rodman. I'm Programming Chair for Sisterhood, and I would like to welcome all of you to tonight's program, Uncovering Judaica at the MFA. Now, we are very fortunate tonight to have a seasoned docent with us and a temple member who is going to take us on a journey of art at the MFA. And what's particularly nice, since this is a virtual program, is everyone has a front seat. It isn't like you were at the museum and there are people in front of you, so you can see everything right there in front of you. And this is the next best thing to being together. I wish we could actually be going on a tour with Ellen at the museum, but unfortunately we can't. And many of you, I'm sure, have gone with Ellen on tours to the MFA and have fond memories of how wonderful those trips were. God willing, next year we'll be able to do that. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about Ellen. Many of you may know Ellen Zarrow-Nissenbaum personally, and many of you may not. She was past president of Boston Hadassah, past president of Sisterhood, and co-curator of the Sisterhood Museum. And I think Ellen will tell you a little bit more about that later on. She has been a docent at the MFA for 20 years. She is chair of the gallery instructors, and these are student guides at the MFA. And she has been a presenter at the National Docent Symposium. In her prior life, Ellen taught math and history in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, and Judaic studies at several Boston synagogues. So with that being said, I would like to welcome Ellen, and I would like to say that we're so delighted you are here, because sisterhood is really about connections, and it is really a tribute to Ellen and to our sisterhood members that we are connecting together tonight for this program. When Ellen speaks, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Here is Ellen. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. Very excited to see so many people here. I am going to welcome people to put questions in the chat, maybe because I know most of you, you know me. I don't want this to be really a formal talk, but hopefully more like a conversation. I would like, however, if you keep yourselves muted and just put your questions in the chat as we go along, I will try to check that out, address the questions when we come to certain objects. And now the hardest part is I'm going to try to hit my screen share. Aha, I think it worked. Wonderful. So to begin, I wanted to highlight a general conversation about what uncovering Judaica at the MFA really means. First of all, as many of you know, there's been a huge addition to our collection in the last decade. But Judaica as a concept has a wide range of meanings. It could be any item related to Judaism, to the Jewish people, to Israel, to objects, to paintings. And within the MFA collection, if you hit or you put into their website, Judaica, a lot of different things will come up. And we are going to highlight some of those as terms of objects, and some of them because they have interesting stories. I want to introduce you to two people. One of them is Marietta Cumberary. She was the curator of European arts and sculpture. But with a wonderful donation from a Kansas school teacher, Jessica Phillips, she became also the Phillips curator of Judaica. Phillips was a woman who lived in Boston in the 1960s. She converted to Judaism in Temple Israel. And then she decided that she wanted to donate to the museum a fund in order to support a curator. Soon after that, as many of you know, the Schustermans also gave a huge donation of 119 objects to the museum, and the museum hired Simona Dinepi as the curator of the Schusterman collection. So these two women actually worked together to oversee all of the Judaica collection. The collection, however, was required, the Schusterman one in particular, was one of the requirements was that it needed to be absorbed into many collections throughout the museum. So it wasn't meant just to be a Judaica collection. It could be among silver, paintings, decorative objects, and this is a perfect example. It's a shofar from Poland, and this one right now resides in the Musical Instruments Gallery. The purpose of this was so that rather than waiting for a Judaica exhibition to be held in which all the Judaica would be shown, these items of Judaica could be seen throughout the museum at any time. Another example is this painting. This one is particularly from the Schusterman collection and is part of also the European paintings collection. Juif Lisson, Jewish Man Reading, was painted by a Jewish Sephardi Frenchman in 1870. It's only 5 inches by 3 inches without the frame. And it was done very much in the style of a combination of the Impressionist work and more realistic work of the time. Noting the date 1870 when the Impressionists were coming about and finding their way. However, at the same time, it was felt that a lot of this work also was reflected in the Dutch and Flemish paintings that were done by Rembrandt and his contemporaries. Those very often showed a lone figure in a room with a dark, fairly dark space or dark furniture, a dark atmosphere with a single flow or source of light, either a door or a window. And here you can see it on the candle in that shine, that reflection, which probably means that there's a door or a window opposite, and that would be on the right side here of the candle. Aside from the title of the painting, what most probably indicates that this is Jewish is that up in the left-hand corner here, Brandon has put his name, but he has also written in Hebrew, the Lord is one. And up in the upper right is the date, May 1870. Our next work is also a painting, the Talmudus by Jacob Binder. And this one is included in the American painting collection as well as Judaica. Jacob Binder was born in Russia, but he lived in Boston most of his adult life. And although he did his early study in painting in Petrograd, he very quickly became a member of the Boston Art Club and developed his style to fit the more modern world. He's known for his portraits, his landscapes, and his still life. Binder, it's noted, is studied with John Singer Sargent, is also influenced by a lot of the impressionistic styles. You can see that when you look up close, the heavy brushstrokes in the back. And rather than that probably being a white wall, when you step back, when you look up closely, you see these streaks of red and green. And on the right, you know that those are books, but they're not really clearly defined. And that's also very typical of an impressionistic style. Even the sitter's beard is slightly askew, although these are shorter works of brushstroke. At the time, because there was the use of the camera, the painters found that they didn't need to replicate in portraits to be exact the way a person looked. That was no longer needed. So what portraitures were then supposed to show is more of a feeling of the person, more of a psychological study. And so that's what the painters were doing. They were giving a feel. They gave an impressionistic painting was this genre for them. Sargent, artists like Sargent and then Binder, who studied with him, however, combined several treatments to achieve this. They did use some very specific and detailed techniques, which you can see here in the talus. But you can also see in the upper right, in the veins in his hands. You can see it in the wrinkles in his forehead. Here are some other very details in his hands, along his wrist, and also the sunken cheeks, the decoration at the top part of his talus. And it also shows the seriousness of this picture by the hand on his forehead. So while Binder chose his subject to be a Talmudist, which we can see when we look at the book, because those of us who know what a Talmud looks like, you can tell by the way the lines have been painted into this book. It is familiar to us. This man, however, was a carpenter called Joseph Freeman, and he was just a member of Dorchester or Roxbury community, and Binder would go out into the community and look for models. So he found this man who had a long white beard and this very crinkly, weathered face, and used him as a model. In fact, Binder studied and did some work in Europe and did the same thing there. But I included this work because it has a very interesting backstory and a connection to the MFA and actually the Boston Public Library. Alexander Brin, who was editor of the Jewish Advocate, encouraged members of the Boston Jewish community to purchase and donate this picture to the MFA in response to John Singer's work, Sergeant Singer's work. He was commissioned to do murals for the BPL, the Boston Public Library, so these large murals on their top floor of religious content, and then of course the murals in our rotunda at the museum. The ones in the BPL included a figure, dethroned synagogue, a female figure that had caused an outcry in the Jewish community. This figure is well known from medieval times and is really rather anti-Semitic. So Brin felt that it was important for the Jewish community to present something to the MFA, with the stalwart of Jewish art in Boston, to show as an antithesis to this figure. So he donated $250 on behalf of the Jewish Advocate. The rest of the community raised $1,500 that it was needed, and the painting was donated to the MFA. Unfortunately, this painting has never been shown at the MFA. But Simona Dinepi has noted the importance of the work, and hopefully it will be shown soon. So one of the most interesting stories of art at the MFA that I enjoy is the influence of this man, Maxim Karelik. He's a Jewish man who left Russia to come to the United States. And he particularly came to Boston because he thought it was a center of both opera and opera music, and he was an opera singer, and art. While he was here, he was invited to sing at the home of Martha Codman, who was a Boston Brahma. She was the great-granddaughter of Eliah Haskett Derby. He was once the wealthiest man in America in this area, and we actually have a number of the objects in our collection. In 1927, Martha owned several homes and invited Karelik to come sing at one of her dinner parties. She was so taken with him that she immediately invited him to go with her on an art buying trip to Europe, which they did. They were there for about a year, and by the time they came back, they were married. And you can imagine the scandal in Boston for two reasons. One, if you notice the dates, he's 34 years her junior, but also he was Jewish and a foreigner. However, they had a great marriage For the 20 years until her death, they were very happy and spent their time buying and donating art to the MFA. Carola created such a close connection to the MFA, even after she passed away, that this relationship between a donor and a museum is considered one of the closest ever. The specialist of his collection was his love of 18th and 19th century American art, landscapes, and non-classical art. It's a body of work which has not been valued by conventional art world at that time. The MFA's large collection of work by Thomas Cole, Albert Burstad, Fitzhenry Lane, Martin Johnson Heaton, people like that, who did a lot of American 18th, 19th century landscapes, is due to Kerlik's love for this art. One of his other fascinations was folk art. So now folk art is still very hard to define, but it's been generally accepted that it's work not done by highly trained artists, but by those who are self-taught. They create work for home use versus work that's commissioned by the aristocracy, the church, the governments, and then acquired by museums. One of the most prized possessions in our collection of folk art, purchased by Kerlik, is this particular piece, a large wooden and gilded sculpture that comes from a synagogue design above an ark. At the same time Kerlik bought this piece, he also bought a weather vane, both of which he donated to the MFA in 1960 as secular objects. But this lion actually, with another one of the same, flanked the tablets on the top of an ark. It was carved for the Anshe Poland Synagogue in Boston's South End. And in 1957, the congregation sold the synagogue to the Boston Housing Authority, which tore it down. So Kerlik bought the lion as a piece of folk art. The lion and the entire ark for that synagogue was the work of this man, Sam Katz. He was a prolific woodcarver from Galicia, and he's known to have made over 25 Torah arks and synagogue ritual items in and around Boston. 5 of those objects can still be visited today. There's one in Anshe Sholem in Lawrence, the Wall Street Synagogue in Chelsea, which I'm sure many of you know is by him, the Adam Street Shul here in Newton, Temple Shir Tikva in Wayland, bought the one from a synagogue in Revere, and it's reported there's a near Talmud on display at a synagogue in Needham. So the power of this object is its dynamic pose. Many times these lions were placed with 1 foot forward or lunging forward. It's sort of an open mouth, flaring nostrils. The ones on the left, the ones we have in particular, are painted red, and you can get a really close look. But both these images represent the lion as fierce, with a forward stride, a fixed gaze. And it's really skillful for a folk artist, one not academically trained, to achieve that sense of motion and steadfastness from carved wood. In Judaism, the lion represents the tribe of Judah and is first mentioned in the book of Genesis. So it's often included on the temple arks for this reason. But this lion tells the story of Sam and all the wood carvers that came from Eastern Europe. It's ingenious the way they transferred their skills when they immigrated to America from building furniture or building arks to making animals for carousels in amusement parks. The lion on the right was built for carousel in Coney Island, and it was also made by a Russian Jew. The lions range, someone asked about how large the lions are. They range in size. So it depends on the ark. So the carousel lion is like any carousel lion. the one that Sam Katz has is, I believe it's 3 to 4 feet high. I'd have to go back and look at it. I'll check it out before I leave you. It's approximately that height. It actually was just shown in a exhibit about Max and Karolick's work, and they had it up on the wall. So I'd have to guess, looking at it, it was at least 3 feet high. But they really found that it was very valuable, and they had a whole book that was listed underneath it that people could read to explain all about the lion and where it came from, and the ark and all of that. It was really quite a wonderful support of this display. But Sam himself, most of the time, made ice boxes and furniture, yet he left these workbooks full of designs of his arks and the embellishments. So somebody could look through the workbooks and pick an ark style and pick the embellishment, so every ark could look different. So he had to make his money one way, but then he, made the arks as much as he could. So you want to see the slide of the ark. Okay, let me see how far back. There it is. So that's the whole ark from, and say, Poland. This is the one that was in the south end. And you can see a lot of the other embellishments, the eagle on the top, these birds on the left. Usually arks always have a crown. These are very typical. And these large pillars meant to replicate the temple, which we'll see in a menorah later on. Okay, let's see now if I can get back. There we are. So there are the lions. And this one, you can see the one from Coney Island, it's quite colorful. The other one was all gilt gold. And that one actually had to be conserved a little bit before they put it on display. This might have been the first time it was on display, actually. So another, what I think is one of the exciting pieces of Jewish art are these Wimples. Now, these are on display in the European Decorative Arts Gallery. And it's a terrific example of the mix of Jewish rituals with folk art. So Wimples are Torah binders traditionally made by mothers from garments worn by their sons during the Brit Milah. So after the bris, the cloth is cut and resewn into 4 strips. You can see them here, 1, 2, 2, this is all 1, 3, and 4. And then the elaborate Wimples show scenes of life passages, words that encourage wishes for good life. This one is embroidered in Hebrew. Meyer, son of our great teacher, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yosef, born with Mazel Tov on Monday, 23 Elul, 5505, which correlates to 1745. So that's when this is done. May God raise him to Torah, chuppah, and good deeds. So once it was made into a wimple, which is used to hold the scroll together, the Torah binders were presented on the boy's first visit to the synagogue, 3 or 4, and then again when he read from the Torah on the day of his bar mitzvah. And then this one obviously was handed down, and there are 3 of them right now in the European Arts Gallery. There's another one that has not been shown. That one's from Italy and much more plain. Somebody had asked a question. I just wanted to go back to the one that was done by Binder of the Talmudus. I do not know why it hasn't been shown yet. I don't know if it's an issue of conservation, but in an interview, Simona Nepig did mention she felt it was a rather important piece and looks forward to having an opportunity to displaying it. So one of the most intriguing pieces and beautiful of Judaica is this pair of Rimonim. It has a fabulous story. all kinds of intrigue behind it. Discrimination, colonization, opportunity, and a lawsuit between two synagogues. In 1492, we all know King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella instituted the Spanish Inquisition, and the Jews tried to flee to safer places. And a typical journey ended them in Brazil, from Portugal. Some of them went from Portugal to the Netherlands and then Brazil, but nonetheless, a group of them had lived there for a long time under the Dutch, when the Dutch owned this area, very peaceably, very successfully. But when the Portuguese took over, they insisted those people leave, not just the Jews, but the Dutch as well. And when they left, there were 23 of them who landed in New Amsterdam, which was under the governorship of Peter Stuyvesant. But he didn't want the Jews to stay there. And he wrote to the Dutch West India Company asking for permission to expel, quote, this deceitful race. But thankfully, the Dutch West India Company admonished Stuyvesant and insisted that the band of Jews receive the same rights as the Dutch who lived there. So the immigrants settled there in the colony and eventually formed Congregation Sha'arith Israel, which still exists today. This is the current building. The original building was from 1730. They maintained the traditions of the Iberian origin and contributed richly to the growth of the New World. Some of the descendants from both the synagogue and those original members were Emma Lazarus, Benjamin Cardozo, who was a Supreme Court justice, and Uriah Levy, who was a successful commander of the US Navy. When they decided to adorn their synagogue and brought in Torahs, they asked this gentleman to make finials for the Torahs. He was considered the greatest silversmith in the New York area. This is something he wouldn't have been able to do if his parents hadn't emigrated from Amsterdam and they were still in Europe, because Jews weren't allowed into the guilds. Silver was considered to be a metal so exquisite that it was worthy of ritual objects, both in Christianity and in Judaism. And these exquisite and intricate turns of the silver in these pieces highlight Meyer's ability in silversmithing and his understanding of the qualities of the metal. The style of the finials also integrate many influences. So the bells were often found of Sephardic heritage and the crowns Ashkenazi. And even these little acorns at the top are thought to be symbolism of America, of the Revolutionary period, because they're often found in American silver pieces. What I like about this close-up is that you can see the smoothness here of the silver in contrast to more floral designs. It's so brilliant and so smooth that the bells are clearly reflected. So this overall balance of the crowns, the staves, the spheres, all of that show how magnificent his work was. So the lawsuit comes when, at one point, these finials were given to the Torah synagogue, and they wanted to offer them for sale to the MFA, actually, who was eager to buy them. Sha'arith Israel said no, that they felt it belonged to them and they didn't think religious objects should be sold. So a lawsuit ensued. And curiously enough, the New York congregation won the lawsuit, but they still allowed the finials to be entered into the MFA collection. So they still sit in the Newport room in the American wing. So it's among furniture of Newport and other things who are all sitting in that gallery. We have other finials in our collection, and these are in the European collection, some of them in the Dutch, as you can see, the Rotterdam. And those also have fascinating backgrounds. and wonderful stories. There's a note here about Meyer's death. I will check that later. I think he lived in the 1700s. That was his lifespan. He was younger than Paul Revere. So this next is a Torah Shield, which I'm showing you just because it's beautiful and unusual. It was designed by Elimelech Zorov, and this one also is held both as Judaica and in the European collection. It's very small. It's only 8 by 6 inches, and the chain gives you another 7 inches. But what's so unusual about it is the back of the shield. And what's so unusual is how ornately decorated it is, because they usually didn't decorate them. And you can see here, this beautiful Rococo decoration here, which is late Renaissance period, all these swirls. And inside is blessing of Jacob. And here above is the scene of the binding of Isaac. And along the bottom, which helps also identify it as a piece of Judaica, is the following Hebrew: "This is the work of my hands, Elimelech Zorov of Stanislav, in the year 1782. So the quality of the engraving is magnificent. It's usually closer to copperplate engravings than to metalwork, but it's beautiful. So next is the first piece that I showed you, is this wonderful Hanukkah. This one's from Germany, so it's both in the German silver and Judaica collections, also European, where it's sitting right now. It also has these wonderful Rococo embellishments. This bottom reservoirs would hold the oil and the wick. In the top here, I'm not sure how well you can see this, but again is the forward striding lion. Holding these little things right here are the tablets. And these figures at top, they believe have been added later due to the soldering and the metal, and just the figures themselves might have been from a later century. But what's really unusual here is one of the figures, which comes late in terms of the Hanukkah story. On the left, both of these large columns are meant to reflect the columns at the temple. The figure on the left is David, and we pretty much know the story of David, and we see him as a hero, and we can connect him to a hero's story of Hanukkah. But the one on the right is of Judith. And Judith had become known in Christian lore as this great symbol of strength. She was a beautiful widow who lived in Israel, in Bethulia, Israel, during the 6th century. And the army set siege in the town. Judith went into the enemy camp, and she went to meet the leader, Holofernes. She got him drunk, took his sword, and cut off his head. And the severed head that she brought to show the Israelites inspired them to attack, and the Assyrians fled. Well, this became a great story for Christians, and they created a lot of paintings around that, and you'll see that. You'll see at the MFA. You have a huge one in the Coke Gallery, in that big, large gallery. You'll see it in other museums as well. But centuries later, even out hundreds of years after Hanukkah had happened, this around the Middle Ages and later in the Renaissance, it became connected. Jews connected it to the Hanukkah story. And so you'll often see this on some Hanukkah. So this is a great piece with a lot of different symbolism, different style, and certainly when you consider the modern era, very different from the way Hanukkah might be made today. So many of these are now done as an inspiration by the artist, not necessarily with particular symbolism, although these have little lions by them. But this artist, Ludwig Wolpert, has chosen to use calligraphy as a part of his inspiration. So on the menorah, it says, "To praise you is a delight," which is a verse from Mount Sur. And on the right are his candlesticks. And they'll say, "I will rejoice in the Lord, my soul will delight in my God." This artist too has its own inspiration, which actually is a motorcycle. He's more of a found object kind of designer, and he used motorcycle parts. You can almost see the tubing here to create his own menorah. And he gained inspiration from his father, who was an industrial artist. Here is a woman, Shang-Chi Shu, who created her spice container as part of a sort of an exposition and a show, not because she has any connection to Judaism, but it was a piece for a show of Judaica in which she wanted to show the kind of art that she designs, which is very fluid. I mean, to me, this looks like an open pomegranate. And yet the old spice boxes reflect a different time and era and different symbolism. So it was thought that in many cultures, there were spices used, but this tower form was thought that in the Middle Ages, spices were very important. They were very expensive. So they were stored high in a castle or a city hall. And this turret sort of replicated the importance of those spices. And you can see the little bell that would be in a tower, the flags that would be flying from it, and these little figures that could be secular or religious. And this particular one from the Ukraine. Around the Mediterranean and the Balkans, the Havdalah ceremony includes the smelling of fruit. So fruit and flowers were very often found in many spice boxes or besamim. And this one looks very modern to me, although it's 19th century. It's a flower in its flower pot. And by 20th century, a lot of the olive wood from Israel. And then 21st century, this one is done with Japanese metal, which is called shikudo. It's a combination of copper and gold, and the larger holes here allow space for the fragrance to come out. These last few are in the contemporary gallery at the MFA. So Kiddish cups were also very important. They're integral to Judaica. And you probably find a vast array of materials used for Kiddish cups. But they had to be, in order to be kosher, they couldn't be chipped, they couldn't be a throwaway material, and so very often silver was used. And again, one of the ways to tell the difference between one cup and another, both of these by French artists, is what was contained on the engraving. So here at the bottom of the cup, it says that it was made in Paris in 1722 and silver. On the front is the coat of arms of the Rothschild family. But it's what's on the back that identifies it as a Kiddish cup. Here it says, "Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy." To Shlomo Anselm from his rabbi on 6th Shabbat, 5576. So if you match that date to the date of Anselm's birth, it's for his bar mitzvah. And it was used to be used as a Kiddish cup. So here's another cup, Kiddish cup, made by Moshe Sabari. So most of the time, these cups are made for Shabbat. That's their intention. This particular artist actually formatted the silver candlesticks the Shabbat candlesticks that we saw before that Wilbert had designed. He left Israel for the United States, where he really learned the modernization of Judaica. He worked at the Jewish Museum for 30 years. And he not only added innovations to existing styles, but he created new Judaica. So for example, he made a bowl for salt water and eggs for the Seder table, which is something that we really don't see as Judaica. And he created a candlestick to use in checking for chametz. And one of the things that he did in order to identify this as a Kiddish cup was he put these etchings on it. So here's a lulav and etrog. Here's the tablets and lion for Shavuot. I don't know if you can see this lion, upright lion. This on top is supposed to be matzah, and down below is a shofar. And then the letter shin for Shabbat. Now, what's so unusual about his work is that this was made from a single sheet of silver. So not only is it beautiful and attributed for wine for several holiday occasions, but it's that single sheet of silver that he has bent in many directions that really highlights his craft and his ability. I show you this because Cynthia Ide's been known for her fluid work in the way she manipulates silver. But also, it's very rare to find women artists who are doing work to identify women's Judaica or Judaica used for women or about women. But the museum is working hard in making that connection. I just want to point this one out to you quickly. It's a Chinese cup with Hebrew writing on it. It was made in China. And it says on this side, good health and life, and on the reverse, drink your wine with good heart. It comes from the collection of David Sassoon, who came from Baghdad. His sons eventually had to leave Baghdad due to discrimination, and they went from Bombay to Shanghai. And there they built a huge business and collected a tremendous amount of goods. They also were very philanthropic. But this phrase, which is thought to be said on Shavuot, is probably part of a service that was given to a couple on the occasion of their wedding. And here's an accompanying plate. So here's another style. It's in the Asian gallery. You also see there's some Arabic here to highlight their Baghdadi roots. So this is in the Asian gallery, although it's considered Judaica. And at the same time, you could look at these and say, well, these look very much like the blue and white Delft. But because they put Hebrew words on it, it now becomes Judaica. So there's more and more to see. We could go on for days about everything that's there. But the important thing to note is there's no end to what you're going to find at the MFA. There's a lot there. It's beautiful. It's in all the different galleries. You have to just wander around and look for it, or you can look online to see what's on view before you go out and look. There are two things I just want to mention to you before I end. One is J-Arts combined with the MFA this year. They usually do a Hanukkah presentation, and because it had to be virtual, what they did this year is they highlighted Hanukkah menorahs from around the museum and paired them with dance and music and educational vignettes. And you can find it on YouTube, and it was really quite good, excellent. The other thing I want to mention is that Sisterhood has very fortunately come to be granted this donation of almost 100 objects of Judaica, many of them that are comparable to what you've seen now. They're just as beautiful and they're just as valuable. And eventually we will be able to show you those. We've had an appraiser come in and look at them. We now have to repair some and polish some and mend some, but when it's ready and when COVID is over and we can have a gathering, we look forward to showing it to all of you. So I hope I answered your questions, or if there's anything else, please don't hesitate.
Ellen, fabulous job.
Thank you.
Fantastic,
Thank you.
Ellen.
Thank you,
you.
Ellen.
Thank you. There's just so much there. I could go on forever.
Wow, fantastic.
Thank you.
Well, we are grateful that you shared this beautiful presentation with us, and we are looking forward to seeing all of you, whether it's virtually or in person, in the very near future. We do have a wonderful wine event coming up on February 5th. We have a another event coming up. We've got our Torah Fund.
We have our trivia. Our trivia is
Yes,
March
thank
1st.
you. Here she is. I was looking for you, Dahlia.
I'm here. Sorry, I was a little late. Remember
Go
having
ahead,
young
take-
kids, my
take it
child
over.
did not go to bed. But I did hear most of it, Ellen. So thank you. Thank you all for coming. But Ellen, I have to say, I know it, you worked really hard on that presentation, and I haven't been in the MFA. I don't know about all of you, but I haven't been at the MFA since pre-COVID. It's one of my favorite museums. So I'm so glad you brought us there. And I am sure, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we would have been able to see all of those items in less than an hour,
No,
because they're in so many different places of
too
the
much
museum.
walking.
Right, exactly. So so you've done that for us here, and that was so great. So thank you. And thank you, Toby. I don't know if she was thanked before. So yes, we would love to see you all. I will give a plug for the wine tasting event. The sommelier is someone I've personally worked with for the last 2 years in COVID virtually, and he is he was the Food and Wine Sommelier of the Year, but he's also the ambassador to Israeli wines. And he has actually introduced me to some Israeli wines that are excellent, excellent wines. They are all kosher. So we're going to do a sampling of 6 different Israeli wines. And he has tricked me one time to, I thought that there was an a Napa Cab that was $100 bottle of wine that was not as good as the Israeli wine that he tested me on. So that's my little plug for him. So he'll be putting those in. And then we have a trivia night on the 1st as well. So hopefully we can all see you there. But thank you so much, Ellen, for putting this together. It was wonderful.
Thank
My
you for
pleasure.
being here, everyone.